World History 2 review for Chapter 12, which is all on World War II. Jumping right into it, you've got the causes of World War II you need to know. Aggression by totalitarian countries, which included Germany, Italy, and Japan. This is stuff we had talked about in Chapter 11, the interwar period. You have the rise of nationalism once again. Problems with the Treaty of Versailles are leading Germany down the path of war. Weaknesses, the League of Nations is forcing the League of Nations to be unable to prevent any kind of war. You have problems with appeasement, which is a term we'll get to here in a second. The Europeans are being pacifists, which means they are trying their best to avoid another repeat of World War I. And you have the U.S. returning to isolationism. They're trying to stay out of everybody's problems. None of this is going to stop, or it's going to encourage Nazi Germany to go down the path of war. In 1933, you have Hitler takes over Germany. He is going to replace the Weimar Republic with a totalitarian dictatorship, and he and the Nazi Party immediately begin to rearm Germany. Once their military is built up, by 1938 they're going to invade Austria. This isn't a regular invasion. They're not actually attacking Austria. They're more like annexing them. But later in that year, you also have the Munich Agreement, where Britain and France are going to allow Germany to take over significant parts of Czechoslovakia. And both with Austria and Czechoslovakia, this is where we're getting to that part of nationalism, because Hitler is demanding Austria and Czechoslovakia because there are significant German populations living in those two countries. The Munich Agreement is the classic example of appeasement, which is the British and the French, they are giving in to an aggressor to prevent war. They are giving Hitler what he wants in hopes that he will stop and not be aggressive anymore. But that is not going to stop him. Ultimately, we're going to lead to the war in Europe, which starts in 1939 when Germany invades Poland. This is going to be the official start of World War II, because France and Britain are going to immediately declare war on Germany. It's not going to go well for them, at least for France. In 1940, Hitler is going to defeat France. And the strategies he's using, the Nazis are using to crush Poland and to crush the French, they're called blitzkrieg tactics, which translates out as lightning warfare, very speedy tactics. And it's all about mobility. They're trying to avoid the trenches and the stalemate of World War I. Hitler next set his eyes on Britain, but he was worried about invading the island, worried that the Royal Navy was going to defeat the German Navy. And so he wanted to control the air, and that's what led to the Battle of Britain, which was a massive air battle fought between the United Kingdom and Germany, which the British are ultimately going to win, and Germany's going to turn their attention elsewhere, including they conquer North Africa, they conquer Yugoslavia, and they conquer Greece. After that, he's going to invade his former partner. They had been allies while they had signed an agreement to not fight each other earlier in the 30s with the Soviets, but in 1941 the Germany is going to launch a surprise invasion of Russia, of the USSR. Meanwhile, in Asia, Japan has its own needs and its own problems. They need raw materials to keep their industry going. They have virtually nothing in the Japanese islands. And so they proceed down the path of war. In 1931, Japan invades Korea and Manchuria. Later on, that's not enough, and they invade Indochina. In the same year, they also signed a defense agreement with Germany and Japan. They're basically agreeing that if anybody attacks any one of those three countries, the other two will come in and declare war on the attacker. The U.S., between these two things, between the Japanese invasion of Indochina and Japan signing the defense agreement, the U.S. decides to cut off trade with Japan, particularly key war materials the Japanese need, especially iron and fuel. And the Japanese are very angry about this, and they see us getting ready to be in their way, and so they launch a surprise attack. On December 7th, 1941, Japan bombs the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. We enter the war, and then, of course, the defense agreement forces, Germany and Italy, declare war on us, and then we are officially fully into World War II. So you have the two sides that are set. You have the Axis powers, which included Germany, Italy, and Japan, and you have the Allies, which included us, the United States, the Russians, the British, and the French. The war despite the early victories, the war starts to go poorly for the Axis. In 1942, Japan is going to suffer major defeats at the Battle of the Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway. And after the Battle of Midway, the Japanese are forever going to be on the defensive. The U.S. is going to go on the offensive in the Pacific Campaign. Germany starts losing against the USSR. The Russian winter comes to hurt their army, and they also face serious defeats at the cities of Leningrad and Stalingrad. And then the war they have to face a second front after June 1944, the D-Day invasion, when the British and the U.S., the Allies, attacked Germany and France at the beaches of Normandy and opened up the second front, so the Germans weren't just fighting the Soviets. And ultimately, Germany is defeated between the British and U.S. forces pushing towards them from France and the Soviet forces pushing through Eastern Europe. Meanwhile, over in the Pacific, that war ends when the U.S. drops atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Japan ultimately surrenders, ending World War II. The war couldn't have been won for the Allies without the success of their leaders. The United Kingdom was led by Winston Churchill. Franklin Roosevelt was led through the war by, the U.S. was led through the war by their president, Franklin Roosevelt, who served 4 terms in office, the only president to ever do that. Roosevelt dies in office before the end of the war. Harry Truman takes over, his vice president. He is the next U.S. president, and one of his biggest early decisions is to drop the atomic bombs on Japan, ending the war in the Pacific. You also have generals you need to know. General Douglas MacArthur led the U.S. against the Japanese. He led the Pacific Campaign. General Dwight Eisenhower led the U.S. forces against Germany. And General George Marshall was the U.S. Army Chief of Staff. And I meant to write up there, he also created the post-war plan called the Marshall Plan for rebuilding Germany and Western Europe. During the war, you have the darker side of the war is known as the Holocaust. Leading up to World War II, there have been a great deal of anti-Semitism in Europe, and particularly in Germany, which is prejudice or hatred for Jewish people. And Germany and the Nazis, Hitler, they had blamed the Jews for all of their problems. Hitler had also believed in something he called the master race, or termed the Aryan people, which included people of the Germanic and Nordic ethnicities. And he said anyone else who wasn't in those ethnicities was inferior. And ultimately, they're going to lead them to the idea of destroying all these other ethnicities. It started out bad, but not lethal in their nature. The Nazis damaged Jewish property in the early 30s. They took away Jewish people's rights. They intimidated them. But then once the war started during World War II, the Nazis turned into genocide, which is the destruction of a racial, political, or religious group. And the big target was the Jews, but they were also killing Gypsies, Slavs, physically disabled people, mentally handicapped people, and homosexuals. The Nazis called it the final solution. By the time they were done, they had murdered 6 million plus Jewish people, and this event is known throughout history as the Holocaust. This wasn't the only example of genocide in the 20th century. You had multiple counts of genocide in the 20th century. In Cambodia in 1976, you had a dictator take over named Pol Pot, who proceeded to kill 1 million plus of his fellow Cambodians. He targeted people like intellectuals and artists, monks, educated people. Like I said, 1 million plus done or killed by the time he was done. The most recent genocide was in Rwanda in 1994, with 2 ethnic groups in Rwanda killing each other in Africa. A group called the Hutu murdered 800,000 plus Tutsi, who were the ethnic minority. The Soviet Union, we saw the Great Purge in the 1930s with Stalin murdering anybody he thought might be in opposition to him, rival military and government officials, also groups like kulaks, who were wealthy peasants, anyone he thought was a rival. The earliest genocide in the 20th century was the Ottoman Empire during World War I. They killed 1 million plus Armenian Christians who they feared might revolt against them during the war. After the war, we see the decline of imperialism. The British and French are losing their empires. Their colonies are breaking away from them through independence movements, but that's something we'll see in a later chapter. In the post-war world, we see 2 world powers. We see the U.S. and the USSR. The U.S. is the only country to come out of World War II with a boosted economy. This was a big shot for the U.S. economy. After the war, they formed NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. We were the primary member. We joined with Canada and the Western European countries to defend against possible Soviet invasion. The USSR did the same. They were the second great world power after World War II, even though they lost so many people, 20 million plus people killed in World War II. But they are a superpower after the war. Just like the U.S. formed NATO, the USSR is going to form the Warsaw Pact as a military alliance. And those countries included the Soviet Union and most of the Eastern European countries. And the division between the two, between the democratic capitalist countries of NATO, Western European countries, and the communist countries of the Warsaw Pact, that division is known as the Iron Curtain, that imaginary line that divided these countries in Europe. Germany and Japan after World War II, Germany was occupied by the U.S., the USSR, France, and Britain. The Japanese were only occupied by the United States, and they were forced to renounce war. And the only reason they did that was because we promised to protect them. That was written into their constitution. There were also war crimes trials after the war. The German war crimes trials for the Nazis were called the Nuremberg trials. The Japanese war crimes trials were called the Tokyo trials. We also see a new international organization after the war. The League of Nations is gone. We have a new one called the United Nations, otherwise it's known as the UN. It is going to replace the League of Nations and be a little bit more durable and permanent. The strongest wing of the United Nations is called the Security Council, and they have the final say in most matters dealing with the United Nations. And the 5 member countries that make up the Security Council include the United States, the USSR, China, Britain, and France. Today, there are 200 plus member countries in the United Nations, so it is one of the largest international organizations in the world. They do a wide variety of humanitarian work for all their member countries. And one of their early important documents was issued in 1948, just after the war, was called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is a document that says the basic rights of people and what governments are supposed to be protecting. And that is World War II and the post-war. So good luck on your test.